Major funding for Frontline is provided by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. Additional funding is provided by this station and other public television stations nationwide, and by the Chubb Group of Insurance Companies, for over 100 years providing worldwide business and personal insurance through independent agents and brokers.
From the Texas border to the heartland of Kansas, these people are hiding refugees from Central America.
Many of them will admit that what they are really doing is opposing the president's policy in Central America.
We have not only a moral obligation, but a legal obligation to give refuge to anyone whose life is in danger.
Tonight, on Frontline, who should get sanctuary in America?
From the network of public television stations, a presentation of KCTS Seattle, WNET New York, WPBT Miami, WTVS Detroit, and WGBH Boston. This is Frontline with Jessica Savage.
A nation of immigrants. That is what former President John Kennedy called this country, and that was some 100 years after his Irish great-grandfather came to Boston, Massachusetts. I guess that looking back far enough, each of us in our own pasts can find a refugee who sought religious, economic, or personal freedom here in this new world. Well, today, many millions of people outside our borders are still trying to get in. Many are seeking to improve their lives, the so-called economic refugees, but many others are political refugees who seek refuge or asylum here in this country. And that's our story tonight. We're right now facing a massive influx of refugees from war-torn Central America. 3 weeks ago, President Reagan warned that a rejection of his Central American policy would produce, quote, a tidal wave of refugees. And so America, our nation of immigrants, now confronts troubling and painful questions. How can we fairly, equitably, and consistently define and decide who may be granted sanctuary here? Sanctuary. That's the title of tonight's Frontline report. It's produced and directed by Hector Galan and reported by June Massel. I'll be back with a closing comment following the report.
A person driving up a highway attempting to transport an alien is a violation. It's a felony violation, and we would prosecute.
We have decided that we are going to violate your law regarding harboring of aliens.
What you're seeing is an illegal operation. It's organized by a network of churches and individuals. Its purpose is to smuggle Central Americans, like this Guatemalan family, across the country. Church members say they're following an American tradition. In the 1860s, during the Civil War, an underground railroad protected and moved runaway slaves in defiance of a federal law. This underground railroad is also a deliberate act of civil disobedience, this time against the government's Central American policies. The churches call their movement sanctuary.
Tried legal aid, we tried raising enormous amounts of money for bond money, we tried to secretly aid Central American refugees, and came to the conclusion that the problem, the essential problem, was a policy of the United States government which was resulting in the deaths of literally tens of thousands of people. The only way to change that policy was to tell the American people what was happening to refugees. Sometimes I do forgive.
John Fife is the pastor at the Southside Presbyterian Church in Tucson, Arizona. It was the first church in the country to go public and declare itself a sanctuary for people fleeing Central America. Now there are nearly 60 churches across the country participating in the sanctuary network and breaking the law. They say in their defense that they are responding to a higher law than the government's.
And we pray for those of our brothers and sisters in the church in El Salvador and Guatemala who bear witness every day with their lives.
Wars in Central America. Both Guatemala and El Salvador have been steeped in bloody civil wars since the late 1970s. Thousands have been killed in violence that has caused hundreds of thousands to flee their homelands and look for safety elsewhere. Many have come to the United States. Some are helped by John Fife's Underground Railroad. In the Arizona desert, 100 miles north of Tucson, is a Guatemalan Indian family. They have been hiding in this trailer for 6 weeks, hiding from immigration, hoping not to get caught. Because they fear for their lives and for their family back home, they cover their faces for the camera, afraid to be identified. Armando, the father, explains why they fled Guatemala.
I left my homeland not because I reject my country, but because of the situation there. The military began to burn houses, and many more atrocities were committed. In the villages, we were called subversives by the military. Hundreds died. Not just a few, but hundreds. That is why we left, because we don't want problems. We want to live.
Rosario, the mother, speaks some Spanish, but mostly Canjoval, the Indian dialect they spoke in the highlands of Guatemala. Their youngest son, Roberto, 13, is sick, with signs of tuberculosis or malaria. Their daughter, Guadalupe, is 17. She is married to a young man from her village, Miguel. He says he's afraid to go back because his brother was killed by the army. He and Guadalupe have brought their 10-month-old baby, Veronica. They say they want to give her the chance to grow up without war. Church organizers have arranged to take them out of Arizona and away from the border to a safer place. It's a 1,400-mile journey across 4 states to a safe house in Kansas. While the sanctuary movement includes many different religious groups from different parts of the country, it's united in its political beliefs.
It's a wonderful opportunity for the church to act in deed, not simply in word. We're not praying for them. We're trying, in some ways, to enter into solidarity by concretely placing ourselves over and against our government, who colludes in their persecution, clearly colludes.
These folks are clearly refugees, and since our government does not recognize them as refugees, we have to recognize them as such. And we have to declare that they truly are people in need. Just like if we were in that situation, we would want people to recognize that we have a need.
So it's both our moral and political obligation to act on their behalf in this very modest way. For us, the risk is modest. 5-year sentence, $2,000 fine for them. For them.
These people have come out of a particular village that was destroyed. And so they really have no place to be, no place to live.
2 Catholic nuns will lead them on the first leg of their 3-day journey. Although drivers will change along the route, Sister Mary Mulherrick, a Maryknoll nun from Chicago, will stay with them the entire distance.
I know the situation of the Guatemalan people. I lived there for 9 years and I saw how they struggled. And I support their fight for life, and I'm still supporting it here, and I looked for a way to help them. And I found the sanctuary movement already existing here, and that's why I came to Phoenix and I met these people.
The family allowed Frontline to film their journey. It's a journey that began a year ago, when they left their village in the province of Huehuetenango in Guatemala. Since 1979, it is estimated that from 12 to 30,000 people have been killed in Guatemala. The Indian villages in the north have been special targets of government troops and bombs. Because of their proximity to guerrilla activities, the Indians are suspected of being guerrilla sympathizers or outright subversives.
In Guatemala, whole villages no longer exist that were there a year ago. In Guatemala, the government and the army of Guatemala are carrying out a policy that I can accurately describe as genocide against the Indian people there.
The U.S. government, which supports the government of Guatemala, says there is no policy of genocide. Human rights groups in this country disagree. They have accused the Guatemalan government of systematically murdering Indians. Rosario and Armando's village was destroyed by government troops last June. After fleeing Guatemala, the family crossed the border into neighboring Mexico. They spent the next several months in a refugee camp like this one here in the Mexican state of Chiapas, along with 35,000 other Guatemalan Indians who had also fled their country. Then, when Guatemalan helicopters bombed their camp, they changed camps. And finally, after 3 months in Chiapas, they joined the mass exodus north, traveling 1,600 miles across Mexico by foot and by bus. Near the U.S. border, they paid a professional smuggler to guide them across into Arizona. Now they are being guided again, not for money, but out of a sense of moral obligation. The chances of their legally being able to stay in this country are small, because the U.S. government limits political asylum to people who can prove they are individual targets of persecution in their country. The government's standard excludes those who are fleeing a general state of violence or war. The sanctuary movement believes the government's strict interpretation violates what America has traditionally stood for, a place of refuge and sanctuary. So the family has chosen to go underground and avoid the battle about political asylum, about how decisions are made, and about who gets to stay. Elizabeth, New Jersey, September 1982. A boat flying the Polish flag is towed into the harbor. The boat had been in the Mediterranean, and the crew was supposed to deliver it back to Poland. But Jarek Kruzovich and his 3 companions decided to turn their helm westward and cross the Atlantic to America. Why did you leave Poland?
Because I was threatened to be imprisoned.
By whom?
By Polish police. Because of my activity in Solidarity Trade Union.
December 1981. Martial law is imposed in Poland. The government crackdown is designed to put an end to the activities of the trade union Solidarity. Soon after, 11,000 Poles fled to the United States, having been accepted as refugees. Jarek Kruzovich, who now works in a chemical plant in New Jersey, came in without papers and had to apply for political asylum.
The United States is well known in communistic countries for its fight for human rights. It's a pretty big and I guess well-deserved fame. So we knew that having no place to go, it would be the easiest to get asylum just in the United States. And as well, political asylum is supposed to be granted to people who are personally endangered by any sort of a harassment or persecution in their own country.
Jarek Kruzovich, a union activist, spoke out for what he believed in. So did Luis Dominguez, a high official in the Salvadoran government a top agricultural engineer and one of the leaders of his government's land reform program, until he was fired in 1980 for becoming an outspoken critic. He too sought sanctuary in the United States, hoping to get political asylum. Dominguez now works as a chauffeur in a New York suburb. Why did you leave El Salvador?
Well, I had to leave El Salvador because the life of my family was in danger, and my life too. Because I was working with the government, and I criticized the agrarian reform project, and that's why they want to kill me.
More than 40,000 people have been killed in El Salvador since the war began in 1979. It is a country where machine guns control the streets, where death squads operate, a war in which assassination and torture are a daily occurrence. Almost no one in El Salvador escapes the terror. How did you know that they wanted to kill you?
Well, several ways. The first one was a note, a letter I received, and after that, some telephone calls tell me about how I going to die and how my family is going to die too.
What did the letter say and who was it from?
Well, the letter said I have 10 days to leave El Salvador or to die. Belongs to the squad death, or that squad. This is a paramilitary from the right-hand side of El Salvador. And the phone calls belong the same aggregation.
When you got this letter and these phone calls saying you'd be killed, did you believe it?
Well, you have to believe it because you are watching every day hundreds of deaths. You have to believe it. They are not kidding.
2 years after he applied for political asylum, Luis Dominguez's application was denied. When did you get political asylum?
Just a week after we arrived to the United States. Our case was pretty clear, apparently.
You're very lucky.
Yes, we realized that after a time.
Were you surprised when you came here and your political asylum application was denied?
Yes, because you always know that the United States is the example for the democracy and the human rights and all about. And when they told you they can give you political asylum, really is a big surprise. But a big surprise because you never expect something like that. You expect something different.
Luis Dominguez, political asylum, denied. Yara Kruzovich, political asylum, granted. Why?
There is a right to political asylum based on neutral criteria, and that's not the way the law is being implemented. It's not being followed, and that's a violation of the law.
Arthur Hilton is an immigration attorney with the Lawyers Committee for International Human Rights. He also represents Luis Dominguez. The law, he says, is being violated is the 1980 Refugee Act. Before 1980, only people fleeing communist countries and certain areas of the Mideast were considered refugees. But the new law eliminated that favoritism. It said all nationalities must be treated alike. A uniform standard was established which entitled anyone with a well-founded fear of persecution to asylum.
We find that asylum is awarded according to ideological grounds. Practitioners in the area will repeatedly emphasize that it's much easier for their clients who flee communist-dominated regimes to obtain asylum, while those who flee other totalitarian or repressive regimes which have notorious records of human rights abuses, are not granted political asylum because, in part, there are reasons why our country would not want to grant political asylum.
Alan Nelson is Commissioner of the Immigration and Naturalization Service, INS. It is immigration that makes the final decision on who gets asylum.
Do you think that INS is implementing the 1980 Refugee Act in a fair and equitable way, applying the same standard to all nationalities?
Yes, we certainly intend and attempt to. There are individual cases. The determination made under the Refugee Act of 1980 is that it must be a case-by-case determination. You look at each case on its merits. So our district director or his staff that are involved make that attempt to analyze the facts and determine whether they think asylum is appropriate or not appropriate.
The other agency involved in asylum is the State Department. It makes a recommendation to INS on every case. Elliot Abrams is Assistant Secretary of State for Human Rights and Humanitarian Affairs.
You do not give special treatment for people from communist countries. You give treatment according to the degree of repression and the degree to which it is targeted on the individual, without reference to whether it's communist government, right-wing government, whatever.
The big question is proof. How do people applying for political asylum convince the United States government they are telling the truth? Government officials would not discuss specific cases, only standard procedures.
We have to try to figure out, is this a person who likes it here and has a decent job and all of a sudden is inventing a past involvement with Solidarity, or is it true? We don't accept that as a prima facie case. You have to go behind it and say, when were you involved with Solidarity? Where? In what city in Poland?
Did immigration ask you to prove that you were in fact a member of Solidarity?
It was, what was said was that it is on me to prove that I was persecuted. But I understand that just my statement and all my story was taken as a proof. And because, well, proof is something, it's a word of very vast, large meaning. And you can hardly expect from people who you fled from their country to have some material proofs of their situation over there.
This Pole was never asked any of those questions. His asylum application was granted just like that.
I don't believe that, because that's not the way we do it.
So U.S. immigration just believed you?
Yes, that's true. And apparently they considered my story reliable.
A lot of people have different reasons for saying different things, but I can tell you that we reject lots and lots of applications from Poles. We reject, in 1982, we were rejecting 91.7% of them. More recently, of course, we're accepting more, but still fewer than half. Still, the majority of Polish asylum claims are rejected. So the notion that a Pole files a claim and we stamp it approved is absolutely false.
But a Pole who comes here illegally, you do stamp, you will not be deported.
Right now, that is to say, for 1981, 1982, sure.
Well, I mean, that's a big thing.
It is not a permanent grant of the right to live in the United States.
No, but it is for the time being under the present
It's a lot better than being
government.
deported back home if you don't want to be, sure.
Exactly.
Sure.
You brought up the
and
phrase...
there are very good foreign policy reasons for doing that.
There is nothing to suggest that Yara Kruzovich was not a member of Solidarity or that he did not deserve political asylum. Most Poles, however, don't need to apply for political asylum. That's because the U.S. government does not deport Poles back to Poland. It is a special policy called extended voluntary departure. For Salvadorans, however, there is no such blanket protection. The U.S. government does deport Salvadorans back to El Salvador. They must apply for political asylum and prove a well-founded fear of persecution.
Did you save the death letter?
No, this kind of letter is very difficult to save it. You destroy, especially when you don't want your family knows about it.
Do you expect a Salvadoran who's been threatened by the death squad to have a piece of paper?
No, I don't expect to have a threat from the death squad. No, we don't expect that. But again, we expect some kind of pattern in his life that might suggest that he or she has been involved in politics. Other Salvadorans presumably would know this. We can check in El Salvador. We ask the embassy a question like, this man claims that he has been threatened by a death squad. Is there any possible plausibility to it? What does it sound like? Does it sound like an effort to stay in the U.S.?
The man at the American embassy when Luis Dominguez was still in El Salvador was Ambassador Robert White, a career Foreign Service officer for 25 years. He was later fired by the Reagan administration for criticizing the administration's Central American policies.
And I looked into the case and found that this man indeed had taken a prominent role in the agrarian reform, and that he was objecting to the military corruption and the increasing militarization of the land reform, and had received death threats. And I clearly understood that this is normal procedure and believed the man's story.
Does he deserve political asylum in this country?
Oh, well, by any kind of humane criteria, even by the narrow criteria that are in operation today, he certainly deserves political asylum.
The Reagan administration is accused of not granting asylum to many El Salvadorans because of its support for the Salvadoran government.
We have every incentive to characterize the situation in El Salvador as an improving human rights situation. And for that reason, it would be inconsistent and embarrassing to our government and the government of El Salvador to award political asylum to lots of Salvadorans.
Immigration is charged with letting foreign policy decide asylum, in part because the State Department, the foreign policy branch of the government, examines every case and then passes on its recommendation to INS.
Do you follow the State Department recommendations?
The State Department recommendations are usually followed, although they are not binding.
It is the State Department that makes foreign policy. How do you then turn around and wipe out the foreign policy component?
It's very easy. You take an oath of office. It says you're going to follow the law. You don't send somebody back to what looks like death or torture or prison because you think it'll make some crumb mad in a foreign ministry halfway around the world. That is, the accusation really is that State Department officers don't care who lives and dies. Career Foreign Service officers who've devoted their lives to the service of their country, and frequently, remember, we're talking about the same kind of people who got killed in Beirut, that they don't really give a damn about who lives or dies. They look at these applications and they say, oh, well, the Salvadoran government might get mad, so we'll just send that guy back. That's the basis of that accusation by whoever makes it, and it is a lie.
Yet a government report, an in-house study prepared by senior officials at INS, accuses the government of sometimes applying different criteria to different nationalities.
Well, your own report says that you do not apply the same standard to all nationalities.
Well, we do apply the same standard. There clearly can be instances where that might not happen, so there can be some questions raised, but we certainly do not acknowledge that there's been any failure to apply fair standards.
Yet the report concludes there has been. Page 2 of the summary. INS has been unable to implement fully the Refugee Act with regard to potential asylees. Page 59. Certain nationalities appear to benefit from presumptive status while others do not. The report goes on to state that Salvadorans must have a classic textbook case while others sometimes get favorable action without meeting a well-founded fear of persecution.
That's false.
This is a document prepared by senior officials at INS.
Not having seen it, I grant that, but I don't care who says it, it's false anyway.
In 1982, only 6% of political asylum applications from Salvadorans were granted. We asked Elliot Abrams why so few.
My sense is that from the Caribbean and Central America, the majority of people emigrating to the United States are not refugees. They are people seeking to build a better life for themselves by finding better employment.
What you would call economic migrants.
That's right.
For Luis Dominguez, it is hard to make that case.
Is it logical for anyone to assume that you would have come to the United States for better job and opportunity?
No, I don't think so, because the kind of job I am doing here is quite different job I can do in my country. Because in my country, I am a professional. belongs to the middle class, and now here I am driving a cab. I think so. I belong to the lower class in this country.
One of the reasons why they consider myself to be rather political than economical refugee was that I was pretty well off in Poland.
What will you do if your appeal isn't granted?
Well, really, I don't know, because I can come back to my country. If United States denied my application for a political asylum, I had to find another country that they gave me the political asylum.
Will you go back to El Salvador?
No, not if there's no guarantee on our lives.
Why are you crying?
Because I get very emotional. I'm very scared.
The first stop on the Underground Railroad is a safe house in Albuquerque, New Mexico. Unlike the Dominguez family, the Guatemalans go underground because sanctuary organizers know that few Central Americans ever get asylum, especially people who are fleeing civil war. The sanctuary movement argues that these people are not economic migrants, saying that they're targets of persecution in Guatemala simply because they're Indians. This Quaker family has opened up its home to Central Americans on the Underground Railroad for 2 years. The driver who takes them on the next leg of their journey is also a Quaker. It is her first involvement with Sanctuary, and for her, the decision to break the law was more difficult.
For me, I know that the fine is $2,000 and that there's a possible jail term for transferring these people, and I was concerned because I have a young daughter and I also have a child on the way, and it is a consideration for me. I don't want to go to jail, but you have to do things sometimes that involve some risk, or you may not be doing what you feel is right. If people knew really how oppressed these people were, then they would be likely to be involved in the same thing that we're doing.
The government is accusing the Indians of aiding the guerrillas. But how do we know who the guerrillas are? They all look like government soldiers to us. Now, I'm sure some of them have given them food or other assistance. But the government has said that all the Indians are subversives. So they continue to blame us. And we are dying for something that is not our fault.
We left Guatemala, our land, because we do not want to die. The military came down to our village in 5 helicopters, and it rained bullets and fire bombs. They killed and burned 4 women and their children. Everything burned, clothes, corn, all our food, so we ran. 2 weeks we traveled through the jungle, staying under trees.
I would like to return to my village, and God willing, someday I will. I didn't want to come here. I have my crops there. My home is there, and it is abandoned.
What is your hope?
My hope is to someday return to my homeland and live there again.
In Santa Fe, another relay, a carefully arranged transfer from one car to the next. A Presbyterian minister will take over as driver.
Are you trying to say goodbye to the baby? You gonna give her a kiss? Okay. Good luck to you.
So far, they've passed through 2 border states without being picked up by the Border Patrol. They've been lucky, much luckier than the thousands of their neighbors who never get this far. South Texas, along the Mexican border.
How many you got? 2 of them. Okay, I see them. See her? Yeah, I think so. Let's go get them.
For the past 3 years, the numbers escaping the violence of Central America have been increasing dramatically.
We're probably looking at in excess of 6,000 illegal aliens a month. What we have noticed is a tremendous increase in the number of persons from Central America as opposed to people from Mexico. We've had in excess of 100% increase within the last year of persons from Central America.
More than 1,000 Central Americans come into the country each month. But who can stay, and how does the United States government decide?
One of our first questions is, why did you enter the United States? For what purpose? And the overwhelming majority of those people have answered to find a job. There wasn't any talk of persecution in their country. There wasn't any talk of any kind of reparations. That was their main reason for entering this country.
There may be a reason for telling the Border Patrol that. According to sanctuary leaders, people fleeing authoritarian regimes don't advertise their opposition to the government. Where they come from, that could mean suicide.
They are frightened to death of people in green uniforms who wear guns and are not about to say what jeopardy they're in to anyone who is in a position to return them to the Army of El Salvador and inform the Army of El Salvador why they're being returned and what they said to.
This is Los Fresnos, a detention center in Texas in an isolated area 25 miles from the nearest city. It houses those illegal immigrants that get caught, either at the time they cross the border or after they've been living in the United States for a while. It is a kind of jail for nearly 600 men and women. The vast majority are from El Salvador and Guatemala. The government says most of them are here just to find work. Economic migrants. They don't believe the majority are fleeing political persecution. Yet everyone we spoke to claims he left Central America fearing for his life.
It's very common for people to disappear. It happens all the time. How is anyone to know what happens to the individual? No one ever sees them again.
I was accused of being a subversive, and I received the Black Cross. Do you know what that is? It's a death squad letter. It had my name on it. It said how I was going to die and be beheaded. I received it at home. My family had to flee, but my brother didn't make it. He was killed. My father was killed as well. I escaped.
When you pick up an illegal immigrant, you begin a process which can either lead to detention and sometimes can lead to deportation back to Salvador or Guatemala. How does that make you feel?
It doesn't bother me.
Because?
Because I see no problem with it, because I see the same people coming back. We've often been criticized for doing this thing. People have said, well, the minute they get off the airplane, they're gunned down, they're shot, they're tortured. Perhaps this goes on. But when I see the same people a month later coming back, after they have been removed to Central American countries without any marks or scars on them, then I don't place that much credence on these statements that this thing happens.
I don't think that the fact a few of them make it back alive proves anything, except that they were lucky.
Lisa Brodiaga is an immigration attorney in Harlingen, Texas. She spends the better part of every day at the camp. She is the lawyer representing most of the Central Americans detained here. The organization she directs is Project Liberty, a 24-hour legal service that attempts to stop the deportation of thousands of Salvadorans and Guatemalans back to their countries. Through contributions, the office tries to raise enough money to post bond for the release of their clients, many of whom could otherwise not afford legal fees. Then she begins the process of applying for political asylum.
We have not only a moral obligation, but a legal obligation to give refuge to anyone whose life is in danger. There are some people that I've become very attached to, and it hurts a great deal when they go back because I am so afraid that that person won't make it. Usually I just sort of forget it because I can't dwell on it. So I think that they are trying to keep down to an absolute minimum the number of people who can reach help so that they can deport as many people as possible. And when their lives involved, that's a much higher priority than anything else for me.
How many of the applications that you filed for political asylum have been granted?
Not one.
The volume of cases is enormous. The office has had to put all the names in a computer to keep track. Last year alone, Brodiaga represented 1,300 cases. For most, she is their one contact with the outside world. Although none of her clients has yet been awarded asylum, she keeps trying.
It's purely political. They have lost touch either of the human values or of what asylum is supposed to mean.
I can't return to El Salvador because my problem is this. If I return, I'll be killed either by the military or by the guerrillas. And that's the problem for the majority of the young people who are detained here.
The problem most of these young men have in common is their age. They are of military age, and their governments want them back home to fight.
You must understand the mindset of the Army of El Salvador. They assume that anyone who is young has fled either to avoid military service, which is considered subversive, or because they were with the guerrillas, which of course is subversive. So any young person of military age who is fled El Salvador and is being returned is automatically suspected of being a subversive. And in El Salvador, that's a death warrant. Anyone who's suspected is killed.
Santana Chirino Amaya. He was 24 when the U.S. government deported him back to El Salvador in 1981. He was one of 10,000 Salvadorans our government deported that year. He was picked up outside of Washington for making a wrong turn at a traffic light. Since he was here illegally, he had no documents, so he was turned over to INS and eventually put on a plane home. His sister, Christina Amaya, lives in Virginia. She remembers what happened after her brother was sent back.
Fue enterrado a las 6 de la mañana.
He was buried at 6 in the morning. My uncle found him the following day and dug him out. He had searched for him all the time that he had disappeared. His body had been burned. His legs were tied with steel wire. He was practically naked, with cigarette burns all over his body. And he had been beheaded.
How did you find out that he had been killed?
They sent us the newspaper from El Salvador.
You want to tell me horror stories? I can tell you many more. More horror stories cross this desk every day than you have probably read in the last month. The fact remains that not everybody in El Salvador has the right to live in America because that's not a nice country. It is not a nice country right now. It is one of the 100 not nice countries, and not everybody there has the right to live here.
Last year, 6,000 Salvadorans were deported back to El Salvador. Sanctuary leaders say that given the human rights record of the Salvadoran military, no one should have to take that risk.
I have said to human rights groups repeatedly, I've said it in reference to Haiti, I've said it in reference to El Salvador, show me this pattern of which you speak. Show me not one case out of 10,000, that's not a pattern, that's a freak. Show me that the people we are sending back to Haiti or El Salvador are in fact being the targets of persecution, and you know what we'll do? We'll stop deporting people.
There is never any documented evidence at the time the atrocity is going on. It is only much later that one is aware of the kind of human tragedy that's taken place. It's the same argument that they used to send Jewish refugees back to Nazi Germany prior to World War II in the 1930s. There's no documentation about what's going on. Even as late as 1944, our government was saying there's no documentation of what's happening to Jews in Germany. That's the nature of atrocity in our time, and what we need to do is use good common sense rather than documentation.
After her brother's death, Christina Amaya asked the U.S. government for political asylum. It was denied.
We who are so safe and so secure behind our walls and our fences and our borders, help us to learn from them what it means to be your people. Having learned, O God, grant us the faith.
It's kind of risky. People have said that to me. Wasn't that illegal? But, you know, when I've met the people, like, it's 8 hours for me, but it's like the rest of their life. It's a chance they're taking. And I think they're doing it just because they want some freedom and just to be treated like human beings.
Yeah.
Okay, take her.
At 10:30 at night, the family reaches its final destination, a Catholic retreat house in Concordia, Kansas. The Sisters of St. Joseph have opened up their home. When they voted on whether to break the law, they did so without hesitation.
And the baby,
The arrival of the Guatemalans, the nuns say, is a special moment in their lives. Like others involved in Sanctuary, they say they hope their actions will help change the government's policies in Central America. In a prayer service the following morning, Armando expresses his gratitude.
I did not think I had so many friends who cared for us. Thank you. Thank you for everything that you have done.
While the nuns provide refuge for the homeless, officials in Washington emphasize that what may appear to be well-meaning is still illegal.
Is this sort of defiance of the law, because I think most would admit that there's no legal basis for a church sanctuary. They're basically saying we're going to flaunt the law and ignore it and almost want to be attacked. And we're making it clear we have no intention or desire of intruding on church property or that, so that's not going to happen.
Hi, how you doing?
So far, no one involved in the sanctuary movement has been prosecuted.
We have maintained from the very beginning that it is not the church which is in violation of the law, it is the Justice Department, and it is the United States Immigration and Naturalization Service, and it is the United States Border Patrol who are acting in deliberate violation of not only our own law, but of the law of the United Nations with regard to refugees.
On the sanctuary question, I'd like to just ask some rhetorical questions, because obviously the people involved in the sanctuary movement are very well-meaning, and they think they are doing the right thing, and we respect that. And we would ask maybe some mutual respect for what we're trying to do also. And sometimes it's ironic from religious leaders that doesn't always happen. But the rhetorical questions are, what is the real theory behind the sanctuary movement? And many of them will admit that what they are really doing is opposing the president's policy in Central America.
The arguments continue, but a reality remains. While there are wars in an area so close to us, Central Americans will keep coming, and it seems clear that they are caught in a foreign policy debate.
What the Guatemalans and Salvadorans are fleeing is political persecution, and even more, God help us, political persecution that in one sense is encouraged by the United States, because we're sending arms to the military of El Salvador, and yet we've abandoned any human rights considerations. In other words, we've never denied any kind of military assistance to El Salvador on the basis of human rights considerations. So they continued to kill people.
We must not listen to those who would disarm our friends and allow Central America to be turned into a string of anti-American Marxist dictatorships. The result could be a tidal wave of refugees, and this time they'll be feet people and not boat people, swarming into our country seeking a safe haven from communist repression to our south.
The numbers pose a challenge government officials must deal with. But if politics is allowed to decide who must leave and who can stay, then we will surely test both our legal responsibility and the moral commitment America has historically made toward those seeking refuge.
And an update to this story. After reporter Marcel's interview with Elliot Abrams and Luis Dominguez, he's the Salvadoran working as a chauffeur whose asylum request was rejected, he was invited by the State Department to resubmit his application for asylum. There are, however, no guarantees. A district court in Washington, D.C. is considering whether or not the government should grant extended voluntary departure status to Salvadorans in this country. And then later this year, the Supreme Court, for the first time, will be reviewing the Refugee Act of 1980, examining that basic question, what is the definition of a political refugee? Now, as for those people aiding in bringing to safety that Guatemalan family, or for as many people as there may be in this country that offer such help, there are many more who would rather those refugees remain on their own shores. Yes, there are those words written on the Statue of Liberty which symbolize our nation's ideal, a haven, a sanctuary for the oppressed, the huddled masses. But the sheer number of those huddled masses needing jobs is threatening to many of us. Yet as Thomas Paine wrote in his pamphlet Common Sense, freedom hath been hunted around the globe, but rejoiced that America would be the nation to receive the fugitive. And that's something to think about in a nation that this month has celebrated 207 years of American freedom.
For a transcript of this program, please send $4 to Frontline, Box 322, Boston, Massachusetts, 02134. Frontline is produced for the Documentary Consortium by WGBH Boston, which is solely responsible for its content. Major funding for Frontline was provided by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. Additional funding was provided by this station and other public television stations nationwide, and by the Chubb Group of Insurance Companies, for over 100 years providing worldwide business and personal insurance through independent agents and brokers.
For video cassette information about Frontline, write to PBS Video, Box 8092, Washington, D.C. 20024.